want to introduce you. This is my brother, Rabbi Yisroel Chait Shlita, and my older brother, and we're in odd times that over the years, Bnei were in Golis, Torah spread out, and there were always different variety ways of learning. And my brother, at a very young age, was attracted to great Gedolim. At 17, he went to learn by Baron Kotler, Zechatat Baruch in Lakewood, one of the early Talmidim there. And then my brother went on and became attracted to the Rav, and very close to the Rav, and to Rav Moshe, very close to Rav Moshe. And he was able to really appreciate the gonus, the insight of these Gedolim, and was able to organize into yeshiva and have Talmidim, including myself, and to show us that the method of Torah and learning is a very special, unique, intellectual method. So he affected, as I mentioned, my life and many other lives, including your lives right here, because you are a Talmidim of Talmidim. And so it's really a great pleasure and an honor to hear my brother speak. And here he is, Rabbi Yisroel Chait.
Thank you very much. That was such a great introduction. Maybe we'll stop right here. Okay, so I think that what I'm supposed to do with you guys is a little bit of Q&A, and I want to preface it by saying that in Q&A, so nothing that I say is written in stone, because a lot of times Talmidim come back to me after I give an answer, and we go over it again, and many times I change my mind, and the area might require some more analysis than we thought at first. So nothing is, like I said, written in stone. So whatever we do today in Q&A, keep that in mind, that the answers might be something that you may have to come back to me, and we could, or with your Rebbeinu, we could discuss it at length. But in Torah, things aren't stagnant. As you see, if you go through a Gemara, on one page, the Gemara can have 14 different answers and change its mind. So we're not averse to changing our minds and to believing that nothing is really fixed. But on the contrary, our minds are open, and therefore, whatever I say today, I want you to just have that in mind, that we're speaking for the first time, I believe, and many times in the Q&A that we have in our yeshiva, guys come back to me, we have to go over it again and go into it deeper. So we have to allow for that thought before we start. Okay, so now I think with that preface, let's start with, somebody want to start with a question?
A little shy.
A little shocked, okay. Let's see, we have to move you guys over.
Go ahead. Here. Yosef.
Yeah, okay, we did it.
Yeah.
Go ahead. What's his name?
Yosef.
Yosef.
Yeah.
Okay, good, Yosef. Well, let me hear your question.
Okay. Would you say that Beged Isha is subjective with our times?
You want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Like certain things that we were talking over Shabbos about certain things like watches or necklaces or rings that are being designed nowadays for men that were in the past specifically for women. So what would you say about guys wearing those things that are created specifically for like men's jewelry to be worn today?
That I would say something that I heard from my Rabbi many years ago, and I think it's true, and that is that when a style begins, the first ones who are involved in setting the style might be over. Because at that time, let us say they make a feminine watch for men, and men start wearing that feminine watch. So the thing is that the first ones that wear it are really wearing a feminine watch. But then over time it becomes accepted, and that becomes a masculine watch. So I would say that the first ones to engage or to involve themselves in that activity at the time when it's defined as a feminine object would be in violation. However, after years go by and that becomes the accepted trend, so then it's not defined as a feminine watch anymore, then it would be mutter. Okay? Yes?
I'm not so well versed in it, but there are different ideas as far as what the like the purpose to life is in Torah aspects. There's like a difference between like the Ramchal and the Rambam. They both have different ideas. Like the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim that we'll never be able to know the purpose of the world. But the Ramchal seems to give an answer as to what it is, and he says like for Hashem to bestow His kindness unto us. So I'm just curious how such an important topic could have like, and especially by two such like great rebbeim could have some kind of machlokes or a difference in opinion as to something like the purpose of creation. So any thoughts on that? Like how could they have different ideas around the purpose of creation? It's kind of a hard thing.
You mean, so your question is, how could you have an argument on such a basic topic?
In a way, yeah.
Well, the reason for that is, I believe, as the Rambam explains, that originally we had a full Masorah which included Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava, which was really a total picture. However, we lost it over the years. And after the time of Chazal, we don't really have a Masorah insofar as the basics of many important basic points which eventuate in very abstract areas of reasoning, like when you're reasoning about God. So since we don't have that Masorah anymore, so great minds will rely on their own understanding and analysis. So one great mind will come out with one conclusion, and another will come out with another conclusion. And since we don't have the basics, because as the Rambam says, we lost it, so the field remains open. And sometimes the most basic points are the most difficult to tack down. You know, there's an expression in Yiddish that says that the Chacham is always by the Aleph, that the wise person is always at the basics. I mean, you see in science the same thing was true, that the very basics of the foundations of science were shook in the last century. So I have a book by one of the greatest physicists that says 30 years that shook physics. Now these are basic things. So you'll ask, how come basic ideas weren't tacked down when they're so basic? But the answer is that basic is really the most difficult, because basic entails the most profound area of the science. And the science of Torah is the same way, that the basic is the most profound. And since we lost the Masorah, so you're going to have great minds approaching it on their own. You're going to have different analyses. Okay?
Can you,
Yeah.
Can you define the word abstract for me? It seems that people use this word to describe, I'm going to say, borderline today people use it when they're reaching for something, when they say deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. But to me, like you just said, because the nature, if we're going to use the word abstract to describe something that is the most difficult to understand, to me it makes sense to describe or to connect abstract to the most basic idea, not to some crazy foreign idea, but the most fundamental. Because it is so elemental and found everywhere in the structure that this thing is built on. It seems to me that abstract, if describing complexity of thought, should be the basics, but I don't really see it used like that today at all. It seems that I feel like, honestly, when I don't take on the word abstract, most people use it is when they mean, I don't really understand what I'm saying, so I'm going to call it abstract. That's really what I see people using it as today. But I hear you use it, and Rabbi Ginsburg uses it, and I don't really fully get the word yet.
Yeah, I'm trying to listen carefully because one problem is it's not the sound is not that clear. So I'm trying to make out your words.
Very loud. Come close. You know what? Come stand right.
Right, exactly. So now I guess.
Okay.
Where's the speaker?
Right here. It's right. The microphone's right here. Just speak loud. That's all.
Hi. I was wondering what the word abstract means.
Well, I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean vague.
It sounds very vague. At least the way people use it today sounds like every time I don't understand a sophisticated idea, I'm just going to use the A word and I'll sound really smart. That's really what it sounds like people are doing nowadays. I don't get what it means, and I don't get its usage.
Okay. You see, the thing is, the basic question is, how do we know, or even if we don't know for sure, but how do ideas appeal to us? And the answer seems to be that ideas, we're not bound. No one's forcing us to say this idea is true or false. Like, for instance, they say when Rabbi Chaim first came out with his derech. So people had a two-part retort. Either they would say, if it was so clear that you couldn't deny it, so they would say, well, that's obvious. And if it was abstract, where you could deny it, so they'd say, who says that's true? So they would use a two-pronged method of attacking his Torah. Now, the basic thing is that every one of us has to be our own judge when it comes to ideas. If I tell you an idea and I say, this idea is very abstract, but you just don't see it, what good is that idea to you? It's worthless. An idea only has value insofar as your mind perceives it and welcomes it and sees that it's true. But if you don't have that process, then it's simply worthless. So what do we mean when we say that a man like Albert Einstein had very abstract and true ideas? What we mean is not that the average person is going to be the judge of whether his work is true or not, because the average person is not capable of such a level of abstract thought. And just like in the area of the body, not everybody's capable of raising 300 pounds over their head. In the area of the mind, there are different levels of ability. But when we see that the people who are known to us to have the greatest ability in the area see it clearly, and we don't, we say, well, I guess we're not on the level, and we accept it by authority. So acceptance by authority is one method. But what you're talking about is acceptance by your own mind. And there's only one way that could happen, and that is if your mind sees it clearly. If your mind doesn't see it clearly, the idea has no value. Like somebody asked me once, they said, well, what about Kabbalah? Is Kabbalah true or not true? So I said to them, it doesn't really matter. If you see an idea in Kabbalah that is clear and makes sense to you and opens up an area, so then it's good, then it's true. Like the Gemara says that there are certain svarim, the Gemara says in Sanhedrin that Chazal prohibited because they contain nonsensical ideas. Like they contain ideas of physiognomy, that if your face is a certain way, that means that you're this type of nature, nonsensical ideas. But the Gemara makes it clear, it says, but still, things that are good over there, that make sense, we do accept. So an idea only has a value to an individual insofar as they see it clearly, unless they want to accept the idea by authority. So that depends, but that's also something which seems clear. Like when you go to a physician and you trust him, so that seems logical. And that idea that he's an authority appeals to you. So you go by that idea. But that idea is clear. So your mind can only work by a clear idea. And that's the only thing that's convincing to a person. So all this talk about abstract, not abstract, doesn't really make any difference. The difference is the idea to you clear? That's the point. The only way we could judge ideas is by the mind that we have that was given to us by Hashem, and that this mind has a certain point where you'll tell it something and it'll say, yes, that's the answer. So the mind really determines what is a clear idea and what is not a clear idea. So there's no such thing as a superimposed type of derech. The derech is basically what appeals, I should say, to the clear mind. Does that make any sense? Is that clear?
Yeah. Can I ask a question time on that? I think it's
So
probably that.
what I'm saying is all these terms are really valueless. Abstract, abstract, esoteric, all those terms don't really mean anything. What means something is that which your mind embraces by the God-given element in you that sees that this is true.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah. So I guess it'd be one thing if we could all figure out the Brisker Derech by ourselves, but clearly that's not true because we needed the Brisker Rav to do that for us. So my question becomes, if thinking clearly is such a difficult task and requires such a serious amount of not only preparation, but before preparation, you have to have clarity of what the technique is you're trying to cultivate. I mean, you can, for example, with shtalis, if I'm trying to get bread, I can prepare all I want by doing crunches, but eventually I need to walk to Key Food and buy some bread. I can prepare all I want to think well, but until I properly ascertain what the proper way to think in Torah is, then I don't really know what I'm doing for preparing. So my question becomes, if it's all about chachma and thinking and basically the brisker derech, then how do you get lost? Why all those annoying why and how questions? Like, how do you get lost? Why is it lost? Why doesn't everyone know it? Like, how did something so elemental as literally how to think in Torah get lost, and then the brisker Rav needs to go and dig it up and then give it back to the people? How is that even possible?
I wouldn't say that it got lost. The Rav one time mentioned that the Ramban really was the most expressive in terms of the derech. That the Ramban is really clearly the brisker derech. And also the Kitzos is the derech. The Kitzos had the derech. And the derech is nothing more than a clarity. Let me give you an example. Okay? I'll give you two examples. Aristotle saw a generation of blacks, And then he saw from that generation of blacks, they had a kid that was white. And then he saw that that kid that was white got married and had a black kid in the next generation. So it was an astounding thing. How do you have one generation of blacks, another generation of whites, and another generation of blacks? So you could ask the question, what's going on here? How is this possible? That's one question. Let's put that up on the board. How could this be? Okay. But Aristotle asked a different question. He said, where is the black in the white generation? Okay? That's the way he formulated the question. In other words, he didn't just ask, how is this possible? This is crazy. He said, no, the black has to be in there. Where is it? Now that formulation is a much better formulation of the question than the first question. Because we today are still working on what Aristotle asked. Because we know now it's genetics. And we're working on the genetics involved in the white generation that will cause the next black generation. So he saw there's something in there. Where is it? Rather than just look at it and be befuddled and say, well, what happened? Okay, so if I ask your mind, which question is a better question? The question of how could this be? Or the question of where is the black and the white generation? Which one appeals to your mind more? What would your answer be?
I'll say number two because that has more of a direction. The first one is just kind of like the, I guess you'd say an emotional question. It's not really going anywhere. But the second one is I guess is a question, so it also has that emotional aspect. That's part of why I'm asking it, but it has a direction because at the end of the day, the only way for that third generation to be black, in some sort of, I guess, abstract reasoning, you'd have to say that there's still some black in the white generation. So I think that's more of a question you can ask, or that's more of a question you can answer, and therefore it's a question that's more of a direction than the first one.
So that's what your mind sees.
Yeah.
So there's the derech right there. Your mind sees.
I wanted to get it, but I didn't get it.
Your mind sees that second question is the proper approach.
And that's the derech.
That's the derech.
That's the derech.
That's all there is to it.
Okay, can I ask my final question on the derech?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a final question.
I know most things get pegged on the Hamon Am, which I think is fair. But I kind of want to, if I can, humbly try and peg this on the Bali Masorah. Why wasn't the methodology, like, why didn't the Rambam have this little pamphlet on this is how you learn Gemara? Ramban says this is how you learn Gemara. I don't know. Ritva says this is how you learn Gemara. All the other Rishonim says this is how you learn Gemara. Like when I read I don't know, Mishnah Torah, now this should just be my I don't know, what's it called? Not developed mind, but when I read Mishnah Torah, it doesn't, the Brisker Derek doesn't scream at me, this is how you should learn Gemara. There's nothing clear like that. There's no philosophy of Torah written that concisely. And because of that, I don't really see how the Hamadan could really be held accountable for not perpetuating the derech. Like it wasn't clear unless you tell me that they had the potential to be some sort of geniuses, and I'm not, which stink. But I guess if that's the reality, then that's the reality. But it doesn't seem clear to me how we can really ask the Hamonan, like it's their fault that they didn't perpetuate the derech when it didn't seem like their Bali Masorah at the time had it so clear in writing what exactly they were supposed to be doing. So I asked Rabbi Ginsburg this question, and he told me that the Rambam intended it to be this way, because if he would have made it very clear, that would have allowed for perversion or extreme perversion. But then you look at today, and I think it'd be very tough to say that if he made it clear, there would have been more perversion today then there is, I mean, then you have today, look what you had today. Chassidus, this, that. How many people really learn Gemara the way the Brisker Derek says to learn? So I don't really see how you can even make that argument that if Rambam would have made it clear, and in 5 pages or less, that's how you learn Gemara, there would have been a lot of perversion. I don't say there could have been any more perversion than today. So I really just don't understand that whole area.
You're asking a historical question.
Yeah.
Okay, could you clarify what the question is?
Why didn't Rambam say this is how you learn Gemara? A, B, C, D equals Gemara. Why so? Why I don't even see a place where it's cryptic. I don't see any place where Rambam says this is how you learn Gemara. Yet at the same time, we're supposed to hold the Hamonam accountable for not being able to perpetuate the proper Torah methodology when the Rambam didn't even really put it together in very, very layman terms.
I mean, who is blaming the Hamonam? I don't know exactly what you mean.
He's asking like this, Rabbi. He's asking that, I think it's a two-part question. First, he's asking, he wants to understand why did the Rambam or any of the Rishonim write a pamphlet, I'm just using what his local language is, saying, this is how to learn Gemara. Okay, follow these instructions, this is how you can learn Gemara. And then the second question is, because they didn't do that, so now the fact that you see that most people, again, what his question is, that most people today are kind of lost and it's a very, there's no direction so far as learning Gemara is concerned. Wouldn't that problem been solved had there been some sort of method to go ahead and tell people this is how to go ahead and approach Gemara? Is that fair, Dylan? Yeah. Rabbi, are you able to hear that?
Yeah, okay. I think you have a mistake with the idea of method. Okay, to you, method is like a magical tool that can clarify everything. That's not really true. Method just means that you're on a certain level of thinking. Okay? Now, the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim states quite clearly that people exist in different levels of thinking. And that's true in every area of thought. So in the area of physics, you're going to have people that are deeper thinkers, and you're going to have people that are not as advanced, and they can only understand up to a certain point, and that's it. But could you ask somebody, why didn't Einstein write a little pamphlet on how to study physics? You can't ask that question because it's not a magical tool. It's a level of understanding. Now you can't expect the Rambam to write, it would be virtually impossible, and it is impossible today too, in any field, to put down what is the proper thinking by a person that has reached a deeper understanding. It's not possible to think in your own mind, not possible to go back and to explain to, let's say for instance, I just presented you with those two questions, Aristotle's question and the regular Hamonam question. Okay, so now a person who is of the Hamonam might not be able to see what you see. In other words, you see why Aristotle's question is much better. But a person who is not on your level might not see that. He might think, well, it's the same thing. They're both the same. Now, how could you explain to a person that they're not both the same if the person doesn't have the ability? That's why you can't have books written on methodologies, because you have to be speaking to a person that has understanding first. And that's something that cannot be given over to a person that is not on that level. So nobody could really do what you're asking to do. It's not like there's an answer book, a magic answer book. When we learn, we have to try to learn with the utmost understanding. What does the utmost understanding mean? It means the most satisfying explanations that our mind endorses. Okay, so the brisket derech is nothing more than, like the Rav one time explained, he said that when there was a kasha, a difficult kasha, going around in the generation, so different Rosh Yeshivas proposed solutions. But when Rabbi Chaim would give the solution, the people would say, that's the answer. That's clear. Because the answer that Rabbi Chaim gave was more appealing, and it was, people could see that that's really the proper approach. So you have to have the person that can see it in order to teach it. You can't really teach it if you don't have the person that can see it. If you don't have, when Rabbi Chaim gave the answer, people would say that they can see that's the answer. Why could they see? Because their mind told them that that's so. So you have to have that mind that endorses the idea. Okay? Let me see if I can give you another example. Let me see. See, people try to do what you're asking me to do, but they don't have much success except they come up with certain signs or pointers. Like, for instance, they always say, like Occam's razor, the answer that is simple is the more correct. But why is that so? In other words, if you ask me a question in any science and I give you a very complicated answer and then I give you a simple answer, why will your mind grab onto the simple answer? No one can explain that because that's the mind. But there is something in your mind that's going to, that simpler answer is going to appeal to when you're going to endorse it. And that's the Tzelem Elokim that's in you. You can't teach that. But it works that way. But the only guideline you have is that the clearer, simpler answer is the one that your mind will be attracted to and will embrace. And that is the only criterion that we have for thought. Think about it. What criterion can you have for thought? I could give you 15 answers. How are you going to know which one's right? But your mind is going to embrace one. Why it does that, I don't think anybody knows. But the one that the mind embraces and it sees clearest, that's the one that you're going to go with. You're going to go with. Another person who doesn't have your level will go with a more inferior idea. There's nothing more that you can say about it. So that's why the Rambam, if he wrote a book on how to learn, it would have to be on his level of understanding, which is not our level of understanding, so it will be completely unintelligent. That's why the Rambam writes in the Moreh Nevuchim that when he studied with a student, he went through with him all the areas personally to see if his mind was up to par. And insofar as it was up to par, he was able to join in the Rambam's thought. In other words, like for instance, you have Steven Weinberger, the great Nobel Prize physicist. He says when Einstein came out with his theory, He says scientists didn't have much, they didn't have much experimentation to support his position. So why did they accept it? They're still experimenting today to see if it's right or wrong. So why did they accept it? He said because it was so clear to the people who were involved with the problem. The answer was so clear that they said this has to be the answer. So their mind embraced it. That's the derech. The derech is the mind embraces the clear thought. When Rabbi Chaim gave an answer, everybody saw, yeah, this is the answer. It's simple. You don't need those other answers. So that's all intrinsic in how the mind works. But a person who's on a higher level can't write a book that's going to make it clear to a person on a lower level and like give him a quote answer book that he's going to be able to use to answer all the questions. Just doesn't work like that. It's trying to simplify what the Brisker Derech is. The Brisker Derech is nothing more than the clearest idea on the subject. Now, Rabbi Chaim was a very great genius, and therefore his mind was able to see very clear ideas that people who are big scholars, when they saw those ideas, said, that's right, I can see that's right. Just like the people when they saw Einstein's theory, they said, no, that's the answer, it's clear. Okay? There were other proposals. There were proposals that when matter is in motion, it changes its size, it changes its speed. There were a lot of different proposals at the time, ether proposals. But when Einstein came along, he said, you don't need all those proposals. You just have to take a look at it this way and you see why it works this way. So he simplified, and everybody saw, yeah, that's the answer. You don't need all these encumbrances. And the human mind is attracted to that type of thought. So the Brisker Derech is nothing more. It doesn't have to be Rabbi Chaim. It could be the Chazon Ish. It could be anybody. Anybody that presents an idea to you that is clear and simple and makes sense. And you compare that with an idea of somebody else who is giving you an answer that's complicated, cumbersome, unattractive, then your mind's going to go for the attractive idea. Who it came from doesn't really matter. It's the idea. But Rabbi Chaim was such a great mind that he came up most often with the clear idea.
Right. How do you wrestle? I guess all that stemmed from this fear that I wanted to systemize thinking, because if you systemize thinking, then there'd be less wiggle room for people to misidentify what a proper thought is. Because if it's just based on, then we spoke over the summer a little bit. It was like that's right. Simplicity equals beauty of a thought, and because like you said, because the thought's more attractive, then people will pick it. But if we could somehow systemize methodological thinking, then there'd be less wiggle room for people to quote unquote mess up and use their trafe intuition to say, oh, this idea is attractive, but really if they knew one more thing about the nature of thinking, they would immediately reject it. It would like that answer that 1 second ago looked so attractive would immediately become very, very ugly. So I guess it's all a question arising from, I guess I'm looking for you to help me out, mostly emotionally. How do you wrestle the tension of worrying that you have trafe intuition, but the like functional necessity of, in order to live a non-schizophrenic everyday life, you have to just trust your intuition. There's like there's like eternal fear that your intuition could be or is off, because it could be off, and that's weighed against, well, I have to eat today, I have to walk out the house, and I have to go on. How do you like, you're just not thinking about it? That's really where I'm at right now. I don't know how to wrestle this tension. Worrying I have trafe intuition plus being aware that I must use it at every second of the day.
I'm having trouble understanding your question. Is your question, how do you know?
Rabbi, I'll try. I think what he's asking is that he wants to know. He's concerned with, okay, he understands what you said, but the problem is that there's the first step someone has to take is that they have to trust their own intuition. And his concern is that he wants to know, well, how do you know you can trust your own intuition?
Why should I trust it?
It could be situations where, I'm just saying this is what Dylan's asking. It could be situations where a person, let's say he doesn't trust his intuition, doesn't have confidence in it. He has to trust the intuition to be able to make the step to know the idea is clear. So he wants to know is that something to wrestle with, and how do you deal with that?
Well, the thing is, the way you deal with that is very simple. That nobody really can say that they have absolute intuition. Nobody. Like Newton, when he came up with his theory of gravity, he was bothered with the fact that how can two bodies have an effect on each other when there's a big space in between? And he says, I don't know the answer. But it seems to me that there is such a thing which we don't understand. So it took till Einstein to explain it. But the point is that you can never really know for sure. Because for sure only God knows. As a matter of fact, science today shows that man does not know. Because if man's mind is not abstract enough to understand the phenomena that it's engaged in trying to understand. For instance, if you have two slits in a card, and you have the nucleus of an atom, or you have, let me say, let's just say you have an atom. You have an atom going through one of the two slits. So the fact is that your observation is going to make a difference. If you don't look at it, so then it'll go through perhaps both slits. If you look at one slit, it won't go through that one. How could we understand such a thing? No human being can understand it. And that's why quantum physics is completely unintelligent. So what does that show you? That the human mind just doesn't have the ability. We just are too stupid. But no scientist will say that because that's going to break down science. But that is the truth. The truth is that our mind is only as abstract, is only as capable as the Tzelem Elokim that God gave us. He gave us certain dimensions. We have tremendous mathematical ability. But certain conceptual ability we don't have. And that's why when we look at one slit and light is going through and you shoot out a photon, and the photon is going to go through either both or one, it's going to make a difference whether we're looking at one slit or not, which sounds crazy. That's why Einstein didn't want to accept that, because it's beyond the human mind. But it shows you one thing, that the human mind is limited, and we have to accept that. So what is learning, and why did God give us Torah? Because He wants us to understand insofar as our level. It's not important if we're ultimately right. The only one that's ultimately right is God. We're all wrong. And only God knows the universe, because He's the only being that is outside the universe, so He can see the universe in its totality. We can't do that. We're a part of the universe. That's why all our experimentations are uncertain. Because whenever we do an experiment, we're part of the universe itself. So we're messing with the experiment. So therefore we can never really attain a true knowledge of the universe. But that shouldn't bother us. What we should do is, upon the scientists, like for instance, Steven Weinberger is very upset about that. Because he says it's hopeless. We'll never figure it out, because we just, if you want to put it in their terms, we haven't evolved enough to have minds that can understand this. And that certainly is true. We don't have the minds to understand it. But the point is, for the scientist, it's a dead end. Because the scientist will say, if that's the case, if according to their concepts, the human mind has not evolved enough to understand the universe, and it doesn't make sense really that it should evolve enough, because it's according to their understanding, the closest relative is a primate. What would you give? How much would you give for the concept of the universe of a gorilla? Not too much. So the concept of the universe of man is really very limited. Not that I'm endorsing the idea of evolution, but I'm just mentioning it as a simple example to explain what they're up against. So the point is that for them it's a death sentence. Because they say if I can't really ultimately understand it, it's worthless. What Torah says is different. No, it's not a death sentence. We have machlokas. And our obligation is to understand the thing as clearly as each one of us is capable of. And that is the absolute goal. So the absolute goal is not absolute knowledge. The absolute goal is relative knowledge, that we should each try to use our mind to its greatest ability. So if we have a person on one level where one idea is clear to him and he embraces it, and a person that's 10 levels higher doesn't see it that way, fine. Then the person that's learning, that's the difference. The person learns Chumash, learns Mishnah, he learns Gemara. Not everybody can learn Gemara. Gemara requires an abstract mind. But we don't blame the Hamonam that can't learn it. We say whatever they're capable of, that's as far as God intended them to go. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? It's a different Weltanschauung. We have a different philosophy.
Rabbi, you have time for one more question?
Yeah.
Anyone else? One last question, guys. Anyone have a question?
Yes.
Louder.
I don't know.
Alright, so,
You can't say no not any more times.
alright, sorry. So, I've basically been trying to figure out if the Torah, from the beginning of creation, was and is the only real source of like good in the world. And that like there's a phrase called Christian Judean morality, which is like morality of the world that runs the world, don't kill, don't steal, kind of things like that. Christians got it from Torah, of course, they just took a lot from us. But I'm just trying to understand if the Torah viewpoint.
Okay, one second. I have to wait till that phone starts ringing. Okay, hold on a minute.
Hello, please leave a message after the telephone.
Okay, go ahead.
So, alright, so rephrase that I heard over here. If the Torah is the ultimate source of good in the world, and if there was a morality before Torah, but was that morality before Torah, before Matan Torah? I mean, there was good and bad people in the world. There was the Avos, but did they get their ideas from Torah ideas? It all just stems whether or not all the good in the world is from Torah. It's also the question is based on like the generations before Noah were evil, but they didn't exactly have Torahs. That because they didn't have Torah.
Are you asking if Avraham Avinu came to his ideas from Torah or not?
That also.
What?
Alright.
Is that the question?
Torah is supposed to make logical sense, so I'd assume that the Avos came to the conclusions because Abraham came to the conclusion of God. So did he come to the conclusions of things in the Torah also, and were those like that's where good came from in the world, or is there an inherent good in people in general, or is it all from the Torah?
Well, you have to have an inherent mind, otherwise you can't think.
Yes, of course, but the good.
Rabbi, what do you? I think his question is, he wants to know, does the idea of morality precede, objective morality, so to speak, precede Matan Torah? In other words, Avram we call a good person, and let's say Dor Mabel were bad people. But Dor Mabel didn't have a system of Torah to use as their moral compass. So the question is that, well, how do you understand morality pre-Matan Torah, or was there such a thing as morality pre-Matan Torah?
Well, when Avram Avinu asks God, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat," can the judge of the entire universe, entire world, not do justice? So apparently he had an idea of justice outside of what God told him. Otherwise he couldn't ask that question, because God would simply say, "Whatever I do is just." So apparently there's an idea of morality and justice outside of God's dictates. And that's why he asked that question. Because he had, right?
He's asking if that's not fear.
Does that answer your question?
Is that?
Can I ask you?
So what
Is this fear? We just said there's something outside of God.
What's that?
Is that fear? We just said there's something outside of God. Right? And God even admitted it. There's something outside of God.
Well, it depends what you mean there's something outside of God. It's not so simple. When you just make a statement, something outside of God. We have to really define what that means. It's not simple. It's not a simple question of fear.
Can you re-explain the statement you just said 1 minute ago about how the question? It sounded like you're saying God sided with Avram that there's some sort of justice outside of my justice. That was what I just understood from what you just said.
That there's some sort of objective justice that a human being can conceive of, and he doesn't need God to tell him that, because otherwise Avram Avinu could not ask that question.
So in all areas of Torah, we don't have absolute knowledge, but for somehow for morality, we were able to be fully aware of objective. I don't understand how that's possible. We just said basically the whole point of life is to be osek and chachma. We'll never get there absolutely. The whole point is to be osek. So, but now you just said, well, we can be aware of objective justice without God directly, or even without God spoon feeding us at all. We can become aware of it. I agree that in certain aspects we can be osek in it, which I really don't even see, because morality is kind of like one direction, and you can be osek in a lot of things besides the right direction. But let's even say you did that. How now is being osek lead to a complete objective, an absolute understanding of objective justice? How is that possible? Something like 5 minutes ago you just said something that contradicts that.
Now, in other words, I said that God only wants us to know that which we're capable of knowing and to abide by those ideas. So therefore, if my mind has a clarity of an idea, I am supposed to embrace it. So if Avram Avinu has a clarity of justice, so then that's the idea of justice that he has to embrace. Now, if he sees God doing something that is not in line with that clarity, he has to, if he has access, he has to ask God, how could you do that? Because my mind tells me that this is justice. Now God has, unless God just wants to throw him away, he has to explain it to him. Otherwise, he would have to say to him, there's no value in that idea of justice that your mind tells you. If God would say that, but then that would be a dead end for him.
Is that explanation the Torah? Is the explanation of the true morality of the Torah?
Okay, well that's one of those questions that I think I made my preface for. Now we'll have to come back to this. This is not a simple question, okay? But I hope I've clarified something that will help you in some way. But as I said in the beginning, that we can't expect to just simply take up the most abstract, most confusing points when we don't really have a clear idea of what we're talking about. So we'll have to come back to that again. Okay.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. My pleasure. Okay, guys, have a good day.